Is that so? Morning, everybody. We are here for In Context, which is part of our lecture series with guest scholars about themes and ideas within plays, as many of you know, because I recognize many of you from previous In Context. But I also want to offer that this is the first time that we've started to Zoom these events. And so what you see here is the owl. And so what I ask is that you be quiet because the owl gets confused if it hears more than one voice. And we will certainly take questions at a certain point. So just also be careful that you're waiting for answers and just so you don't overlap and things like that. Okay. We are really honored today to have with us a tremendous scholar in the study of Mary Magdalene. He is not with us in person because he is in Paris right now. And so we are delighted that he was willing to make his schedule work, given the fact that he's in Paris. And so you have his biography in your program. And so I'm just going to hand it right to you, Dr. Chilton. And thank you for joining us today and welcome to CATF.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss Mary Magdalene in history, and I'm especially grateful for all of the arrangements necessary to make this work. All of them are right outside of my own capacity. I also, because of this arrangement, was able to have a look at Marc St. Germain's wonderfully incisive script and was delighted to see that he, through his dialogue in the play, was willing to deal in a playful way with some of the legends that I encounter when I'm here in France. I have been to the site in Vézelay, right near Paris, where it was said that Mary Magdalene's skeleton was kept, including her skull. And also, I have been far down south, where it is alleged also that the skeleton of Mary Magdalene is present and that her skull is there. Medieval legend was extremely lush, and it was also very skillfully developed, with the result that some claims about Mary Magdalene, which do not hold up very well, have got themselves into the bloodstream of how it is that currently we speak about her. Marc St. Germain has some fun with the idea of her going to Europe, which doesn't appear to have been likely at all. And one reason for which that doesn't seem at all likely has to do with the place where she was born and the place where, in all likelihood, she died. As she says in the play, what's my name again? Is it Mary Magdalene? And where am I living? It's Magdala. Why did you have, Peter, any difficulty in finding me? Well, we can say some things about this place as a result of current archaeological investigations, which have been going on for some time. So I wonder, Amy, whether you could share that first image that I sent along so that people can see the physical site of Magdala, or what is left of it, rather.
Absolutely. Could you give us the name of the image?
Yeah, image one. And they'll image one and they'll go right through as enumerated that way. I thought that would be the most straightforward way.
And then, yeah, we did, but it just takes a minute sometimes. Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's fine. As the image comes up, what I'll prepare you to see is very little, because part of the point of what you can see is that this has been a site of destruction. And it's the result of destruction by the Roman army in the year 67. We have a very good description of the Roman campaign that included action against Magdala from someone who was actually alive at the time, the Jewish historian Josephus. And he describes how the Roman forces came through, utterly destroyed the place, and made a deliberate policy of enslaving only the very young members of the population, and then taking the remaining adults and slaughtering all of them at once. One thing that the life of Mary Magdalene shows you in context is that the kind of violence that was exerted against Jesus was only a prelude to the extraordinary wave of destruction that was to follow after his death. This place called Magdala, you may notice from what's left, has a very prominent stone structure in the middle of it. And this is the place after which it was named. In Aramaic, Magdala means plinth or foundation or tower. And it was a place where fish from the Sea of Galilee, which at that time was much closer than it is right now. You can see from the picture that it is a longish and wet walk to the Sea of Galilee. The sea was much nearer in the first century of the Common Era. And on this plinth, fish could be dried and salted, and that became a major profit-making enterprise within Tiberias. It's of interest that one of the characteristic foods of the early Christian movement was salted fish. And at its earliest stage, Magdala would have been an important source for exactly that. This industry put them in contact with another city very nearby along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, which was known as Tiberias. And so as I'm speaking, perhaps we can bring on the image two, which tells us something about Tiberias. Today, you can visit Tiberias, and it's not all rubble. It has been built up. The result of that is archaeology is much more difficult, though some is in fact going on. Yet even without having to get to the issue of discovering which precise levels of Tiberias correspond to the first century, we have the example, for example, right here, of a coin struck in order to celebrate Tiberias as a city. On the right-hand side, you can see its name given to you in Greek letters. And on the left-hand side, you see it's a coin with its value given. And you'll have perhaps more difficulty seeing it, but on the rim of the left side, you have the name being given Herodotus, Herod. Oh, only it's not that Herod. That is, it's not Herod the Great. It is his son, Antipas. But as we can see from this coin, Antipas just loved co-opting his father's name to make him more important. And he also felt that he should celebrate his own status by symbols of prosperity. So here on that left-hand side, you can see that he has had stamped on the coin what he thought of as being the image of a date palm, only it looks really scrawny. It truly is not in the least convincing. So isn't it interesting that Jesus actually made fun of exactly this image when Jesus was talking about Antipas's greatest enemy, John the Baptist, he asked the rhetorical question, "What did you go out to the wilderness to see? A papyrus blowing around in the wind?" That is, Jesus dismissed this image as looking much more like a papyrus, a reed, than it looks like a date palm. But Antipas was extremely proud of this city. He named it after the emperor Tiberius. That's what got its name. And he decided to go ahead with its construction no matter what obstacles he faced. The most important of those obstacles was that while building was going on, it was discovered that they were actually founding this city partially on the site of a cemetery. Now, of course, within the Judaism of this time, that meant that Tiberias was an unclean site and was not an appropriate place for observant practitioners of Judaism to live. As a result, Antipas had to resort to bribery and sometimes forced removal in order to find himself a population. When he did so, that put Tiberius in instant touch with Magdala. Magdala, in effect, became a service community for this new, and in the eyes of many Jews, unclean project. When uncleanness is elicited in the understanding of the Judaism of this time, the result is damage to the community and damage to individuals. When the Gospels refer to what we call today demons, they often use the phrase unclean spirit. And by unclean spirit, they mean an impetus within a person that puts that person into a self-destructive spiral. Jesus is well known as an exorcist within the pages of the New Testament and elsewhere. But there's only one person who is known to have been a recipient of Jesus' exorcism, and that is Mary Magdalene. Mary is referred to this way specifically in the Gospel according to Luke. And Luke's Gospel goes on to say that 7 demons had gone out from Mary Magdalene, suggesting that we're dealing with a sequential exorcism over time. That makes it all the more interesting that within the Gospels, when there are references to specific exorcisms, they occur in the vicinity of Magdala, either in the nearby town of Capernaum, that I'll come to in just a moment, or across the Sea of Galilee. And these stories often provide remarkable detail about the kind of behavior that led to the understanding that a person was being afflicted by an unclean spirit. Probably the most vivid account is in the Gospels of the person who was possessed of what he himself called a legion of demons. And of course, legion is a word that referred to the same Roman army which was known to be an unclean threat and which ultimately, of course, would destroy Magdala. He describes himself as having a legion of demons. He himself lives in a graveyard, understood to be a place of uncleanness. He wounds himself so that blood is on his skin, which makes him unclean as well. And also, he himself engages in violence, and in that cannot be contained. Exorcism is understood as a means of identifying those kinds of forces that put a person at odds with oneself. And the one person who is most closely identified with these stories and the practice is exactly Mary Magdalene. Now, in order for her to meet Jesus, in order for her to begin to understand what his practice of exorcism was, she had to leave her native Magdala, also remove herself from the vicinity of Tiberias, and make her way to Capernaum, of which we do have an image labeled image number 3. In this image, what you'll be able to see is that it's not today a built up city. However, there are many more remains of the ancient city. Uh, I'm going to ignore the foreground for just the moment and just focus your attention on the darker stones beyond the limestone or marble in the foreground. Those darker stones are called basalt. They're a volcanic stone. They are relatively easily worked. And throughout Capernaum, you can see a kind of warren of the kinds of homes which are discussed that were visited by Jesus and his immediate followers. They were typically foundationally built on basalt, and then they come to mud and straw roofs on the top. They're very basic buildings. They are not designed to be luxurious, and they aren't. Their function is to quarter people who were involved in the principal commercial activity of Capernaum, which was like in Magdala, fishing, only fishing more that was involved with boats rather than casting nets, as in the case of Magdala. One of the particular houses in Capernaum, if you visit Capernaum today, is identified very prominently as St. Peter's House. I don't believe myself that we can say where particular people lived during the first century in Capernaum, but what's left of that dwelling is certainly like what people lived in during the first century. Uh, Now, I'll come to the foreground because this is actually giving us a good example of how it is that archaeologists need to be careful about the periods that they're referring to when they're assessing what life was like in any kind of ancient city. You can see that this is some structure built not of basalt, which is a dark stone, but of limestone, marble, and indeed, as it turns out, a combination of this. This is from the base of a later synagogue in Capernaum. It appears to be the case that this later synagogue was built on top of an earlier one because its foundation is basalt. So this was the rough site where Jesus is described in the Gospel according to Mark as encountering a person with an unclean spirit in a synagogue. And Capernaum is also the likely place of meeting of Jesus and Mary Magdalene because Capernaum became Jesus' base, the only place where he was reasonably settled, and then only for a couple of years' time. I think it's much easier to understand how this interaction worked out if we also take a look at a map. This is in image number 4. And the point of the map is to enable us to see how close, first of all, Tiberias is to Magdala. Uh, I have made that walk very easily. Uh, Perhaps we could blow that up a little bit with a concentration on the Sea of Galilee. that permits us, yeah, that's very good. That perfect, just there, I think. That permits us to see Tiberias just here, and then up from that, Magdala, and then to the north and the east, Capernaum. Incidentally, you see, this is one of the reasons maps are useful to work with. You also see the easy distance of Capernaum to Bethsaida, which was the birthplace of Peter. So being there made it much, much easier for Peter, either over land or by means of boat, to have contact with events that were going on in Capernaum. And Capernaum is also the location where Jesus gathered a sizable number of disciples and came to be very well known. So well known that this same local ruler, Antipas, that I referred to earlier, decided that as he had earlier had John the Baptist executed, so he also wanted to do away with Jesus, provoking an event we'll come up to, namely Jesus' decision against his usual habit of remaining in Galilee to go much further south to Jerusalem. Perhaps at this point we could just uh, zoom out a little bit on this map so that we can see that Jerusalem is really, we've got to go a little bit more, we've got to go past Samaria, and then we get to the Dead Sea, and then to the west of that to Jerusalem. This, again, is a relatively short distance as we think of distances at the moment. But during the first century, the Romans had not established what they later did in the second century, namely a very elaborate road system, which was designed from that time to deny the possibility of any kind of Jewish revolt against Roman power. Uh, just to say that that implies that the decision to go to Jerusalem required considerable motivation. And part of that motivation was the decision by Antipas to have Jesus executed. And indeed, it turns out that in Jesus' reaction to the assault from Antipas and his decision to go to Jerusalem, Mary Magdalene played a very important role. And this brings us to a second way in which she had a formative historical influence on the development of Jesus and therefore Christianity. One of those influences we've already discussed is exorcism and the understanding of what exorcism is. And the other is the practice of anointing. Anointing is also concerned with a form of therapy that we might compare to exorcism, but it's a form of therapy which has a different purpose and is occasioned by different conditions on the part of the person who suffers. Anointing is understood within the first century and before and after to be a very widely practiced method of dealing with people who are suffering from some malady. Oil, generally speaking, olive oil, was used for purposes of cleansing throughout the Mediterranean world and certainly in the ancient Near East. So that if a person was wounded or if that person were suffering from any kind of pain, the usual method was the application of olive oil for anointing. This need not be a specifically religious practice, though sometimes it was. Sometimes anointing could be used not merely to help with healing and to ask for healing, but also to designate people for certain important commissions. So, for example, in the very ancient period of Israel, the king, David, say, or Solomon, would be a person who was anointed. And that practice of royal anointing has literally been continued until our day. A prophet can also be anointed in order to signal that that prophet is the successor of the prophet who came before him. The high priest would be anointed. So, anointing has a range of meanings uh, that goes from perfectly ordinary dealing with physical pain to a very specific commission that a person is given by means of that anointing. In the case of Mary Magdalene, one of the very interesting statements about her, which is made in the same section of Luke's gospel, it's the very beginning of chapter 8, that mentions her having been freed of seven demons, also speaks of how she was able, along with other women, to provide the movement around Jesus, then centered in Capernaum, with the means to carry on their daily existence. This was the source of a later legend that Mary Magdalene herself was wealthy from her birth. There's no indication of that. There's no indication, as was said in the Middle Ages, that she lost her wealth because she became a prostitute. Uh, as far as I can see on the historical record, Mary Magdalene only became a prostitute in the 6th century of the Common Era, that is, long after she had died. And the reason that happened was that Pope Gregory the Great gave a sermon in the year 594 in which he combined different figures from the Bible. He combined Mary Magdalene, the woman who's described as a sinner in a different passage in Luke, and the female figure in the Song of Songs. He put them all together and regularly made them into a symbol for the individual souls of the monks he was preaching to in his sermon. So he was operating in a clearly symbolic mode when he associated Mary Magdalene with prostitution, but the association stuck and then became a part of her legend. Much later still, that profession brought her into contact with Jesus. And it was claimed that she was Jesus' concubine in the 13th century. And then centuries later, in 1982, it was claimed that they actually had a child. It's just an example of how it is that these statements, which sometimes are made initially with symbolic interests, get woven into claims about Mary Magdalene, which distract us from her actual impact. Because what she was doing in terms of anointing was profoundly important for Jesus' movement. And not only because her doing that provided them with some support, it did that, that was vitally important. But it's very interesting that in addition to that, Jesus and his followers themselves took up the practice of anointing. That is, they began to engage in what was widely considered to be, in the ancient Near Eastern world, typically a woman's activity. Here, the disciples of Jesus, the male disciples of Jesus, begin to engage in precisely that. So it is not surprising, given this kind of influence on Jesus' movement, that when Jesus, as I mentioned before, did go from his native Galilee to Jerusalem, Mary Magdalene came with him. She was a part of this very important entourage, certainly much bigger than 12. Uh, the reference to the 12 disciples should never be taken as a limit to the number of followers around Jesus. He picked 12 with a specific intent that they should go out on his behalf and engage in activities like his. But he chooses them from a much wider group, which in fact was not given that instruction to become itinerant. So we're dealing with a much more substantial group of people, including women. The Gospels are quite specific about that. Mary Magdalene, in regard to being a female disciple, is only one example among many. But this movement to Jerusalem brings her, as it brings the whole movement, into a different territory and to someone else's influence. And that brings us to image number 5, because now we're dealing with a power structure in Jerusalem with which Jesus had no familiarity, and that was also unknown to his disciples. Part of that power structure involves the enormous authority of the person who was the high priest. The high priest, by the way, would be anointed for his function. The high priest at this time was named Caiaphas, and we can now be much more secure about Caiaphas than we once were, because this object that you can now see was identified as a result of a chance find at the end of the 20th century. And it is what's called an ossuary, because what that means in Latin is that it's a bone box. That is, when a person was interred in the vicinity of Jerusalem, that person was typically brought to a burial cave. And I'll show you the perspective of that cave in just a moment. Was brought to a burial cave, put on a shelf inside. The cave was then covered with stone. And after the person's flesh had decayed, after approximately a year, the bones were gathered and they were either put in a pit inside the same burial cave, or in the case of some prominent people, like Caiaphas, they were given final resting places in limestone burial boxes of this kind. You can see this one is ornate. What you can't see is that if I gave you examples of another couple hundred of these, and there are such examples, it's been very rich area for finds, what you would see is that this is really quite remarkably ornate. And the ornamentation corresponds to ornaments found in association with the temple and with synagogues, endorsing the connection with Caiaphas, but also Caiaphas' name actually appears on the side and on the back of the box, both in Aramaic and in Hebrew. So we know something of how this high priest was someone who enjoyed very high status in the first century. That's important for us to know because he's exactly the person with whom Jesus comes into conflict. And Jesus' conflict has to do with the issue of what the basic purpose of the temple in Jerusalem truly was. Caiaphas took the point of view of someone who was the head of the sacrificial system, and he introduced a change in the way in which people could acquire animals for sacrifice, so that trade went on in the large court of the temple. Jesus took the position that having trade there was directly opposite to the prophetic teaching of how it is that the temple should function as a place of worship alone and not for the sake of trade. Their confrontation with one another took place in a literally monumental setting. And this brings us to image number 6. In this setting, Jesus takes the decision that he, in fact, is going to confront Caiaphas by going to the large outer court of the temple and engage in his famous expulsion of the people who were buying and selling animals. Now, if you look at an aerial photo of the temple today, you can understand why this kind of activity would go on, and you'd also immediately understand that in order for any change to occur, one would have to intervene with force. Today, what you see in the Golden Dome is the Dome of the Rock, and then to the left is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Both of these are enormous structures, but they seem small as compared to the very large enclosure that was built by Herod the Great for the temple in Jerusalem. The original temple structure was destroyed by the Romans. When they invaded Jerusalem, they came down from Magdala in the north to Jerusalem, completely destroyed the temple, but not the enclosure and the city in the year 70. But when the temple still stood, Caiaphas was in charge of an enormously influential and seemingly unbeatable institution. So Jesus' decision that he was going to confront Caiaphas is one that was taken ultimately with his knowledge that the result of the confrontation could well be his death. What leads to his final conviction that he should nonetheless intervene is that he is anointed. He's anointed in Jerusalem in the course of his final meetings with his disciples. And that anointing is what causes him to undertake this fateful confrontation. The most likely person to have performed that anointing was exactly Mary Magdalene, the one person in all the Gospels who's associated with the act of anointing and also with the decision that Jesus made that resulted in his death. So, in two ways, in regard to exorcism and anointing, we can see Mary Magdalene's formative influence on what we can know about Jesus and vital practices within his movement. And that takes us to the third and final way in which she also proved to be influential, and that is in regard to vision. And this contribution unfolds exactly in the context of Jerusalem and this final confrontation that I've referred to. And so that will take us to image number 7. Image number 7 probably will take a little bit of blowing up. It's an amateur image. I know that because I took the picture. And it gives us a view of the temple from the perspective of where Caiaphas was buried. We know Caiaphas was buried there. We are now to the south of the temple, looking forward. It's a very appropriate place to bury a high priest because then his burial site is in view of the temple. But what's very interesting is that when Jesus was buried, the Gospels agree that the person who made his burial cave available was Joseph of Arimathea. And Joseph of Arimathea was also a member of the same council over which Caiaphas presided. So this becomes the likely burial place of those associated with the council known as the Sanhedrin, and therefore also the likely burial place of Jesus. It's in a site which is secluded as compared to the city itself. And it's interesting that all of the Gospels, when they come to recount how Mary Magdalene and her followers went to the gravesite, depicts them as doing so with some privacy. This site provides them with exactly that. The earliest of all of these accounts is in the Gospel according to Mark. And within Mark, Mary Magdalene and her associates are going in order to anoint Jesus, to complete the process of his burial, which could not be entirely finished at the time of his death. As a consequence, when they go there, they're going there as an intimate matter and entirely on their own. And what follows is actually the engine of earliest Christian belief in the resurrection. That engine is the vision of Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene encounters what is described in the text as a young man who tells her to go to Jesus' followers in Galilee, including Peter, and to tell them that in Galilee they will also see Jesus. In other words, the story of the tomb in Mark, the earliest, is not of Mary Magdalene's encounter with Jesus. It's a story of Mary Magdalene herself having a vision of a young man that tells her to tell the others to practice similar visions and so to come to know Jesus as risen from the dead. This visionary practice is actually embedded in many different stories about Mary Magdalene. As I mentioned, she appears in all the Gospels in association with the tomb, but beyond that, in much later materials, for example, the Gospel according to Mary, which is probably written in the 3rd century, and the Gospel according to Philip, probably written in the 5th century. She has other specifically visionary encounters with Jesus in which she is further informed about Jesus' desires for the movement which is formed up in his name. In other words, Mary provides a map for what early visionary practice was within the formative years of Christianity, just as she does in regard to exorcism and anointing. So from my point of view, in order to understand her historical importance, what it is most important to do is to understand how she influenced those activities and how they, in turn, had an impact on the development of his movement. Well, I hope you find those few remarks helpful. I also have available, if we want to see it, a chronology of Mary Magdalene, which talks about the chronology of her life and also the chronology of her legend. But before getting into those weeds, I wanted to see whether there might be questions that people have.
You may have some questions. Offer also for the people on Zoom that we are taking questions via chat. So if anybody has any questions there, Lydia will let us know. So anybody have any questions for Dr. Chilton?
Yes, I don't know if you can see me, you talked about where, the guy that you said was in the ossuary, is that his name? But was buried, and that was also maybe where Jesus was buried,
Yeah, where Caiaphas was buried. Uh-huh.
where is that in Jerusalem? Do you know where that is in
Yeah, I
Jerusalem?
do. Yeah, actually it's one of my favorite, as you might imagine, it's one of my favorite places to go to in Jerusalem because when that ossuary, of which I showed you a picture, was discovered, I consulted with the excavators, particularly in regard to the names on the side, because as I said, you actually have Caiaphas's name there. So it's not as if this is speculative. Uh, Caiaphas appears to have been buried just there. And just another uh, bit of information, which I think is really quite important. He's not only called Caiaphas, Caiaphas is the name he's given in the Gospels. He's on the ossuary, he's called Joseph, son of Caiaphas. And that's exactly how he's referred to in rabbinic literature. So it appears to be the case that we are indeed dealing with this person. And the site is on the outskirts of a village of Jerusalem known as Abu Tor. And you can easily, there are signs to it. You know, you can move right along there. And as you go just beyond Abu Tor, you come to the edge of a beautifully developed park. That park comes down in terraces and is really extremely well kept. And that's why the ossuary was discovered. When they were putting the park in, a, a bulldozer, in order to make the terraces, actually took the top off the cave. And fortunately, the excavators informed the Israeli Archaeological Authority, and they saw to it that a proper identification was done. So that's what tells us that this was his burial place, and therefore it suggests that those who are higher class in Jerusalem, especially those who belong to the Sanhedrin, the council, uh, would also have been buried there. In other words, that this was a cemetery for the high end of people who were in authority. And so that's why I think this is a far more plausible location for Jesus' burial cave than the current site. The current site, of course, is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
Exactly what I was gonna ask, because I used to live on the Tayelet, well, right off in the residential part on the other side of the Tayelet that you're talking about.
Yes, that's right. Exactly. It was that. It was the Tayelet they were working on when they found the ossuary. And you were right there. Yep. In my opinion, if you just walk along the dirt path that
Yeah.
separates the Tayelet from Abu Tor, you can find the location of Caiaphas uh, cave.
Wow.
Mine was almost exactly the same, but it was, so we have two sites of where Jesus was buried, and it depends which Christian perspective you have. So you're saying that the cave was closer to this than obviously the middle of Jerusalem?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, first of all, I would say that the perspective I'm developing on the place where Caiaphas was buried is not a Christian perspective. It's right. It's an archaeological find, and my association of Jesus' burial with that, I would say, is a finding of scholarship and not a specifically Christian assertion. The problem with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre has, as a site of Jesus' burial, has always been that it is not well established as a first century cemetery. And it would be a very strange place to have a cemetery. I mentioned earlier the difficulties about Tiberias. when a cemetery was discovered there in the course of excavating in order to build. It's not surprising that kind of thing occurred. I mean, real estate for burial was actually quite scarce. And, sometimes these sites were destroyed successively over time, so that building could result in your discovering quite innocently that there was an important burial site underneath you. But you wouldn't deliberately put one in the middle of your city, nor would you do so in particular in Jerusalem, because it's the site of the temple. When the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built, the reason was that the mother of the Emperor Constantine had a dream. And in the dream, she said it was disclosed to her that in Jerusalem, what was presently the Temple of Venus was really the original site of the death of Jesus. That is an example, it seems to me, of legend making. And over the course of time, because people come to like their legends, they can find reasons to support them. But I don't particularly think that it really is a very strong candidate.
Oh, question on Zoom?
Yes, we have a couple. Barbara would like to know, was there any relationship between Mary, Ann, and Peter during an earlier time in the setting of the play?
Did you hear
Yeah,
that question?
I heard everything except during an earlier.
In the setting of the play.
Earlier time.
Oh,
is
the setting of the play. Excellent. Well, yes, I think there is. I think that's a very good question. The setting of the play, of course, is after the death of Jesus. It has them put at odds. I think also putting them at odds is plausible. I think you don't have to read very deeply into the New Testament to see the enormous amount of disagreement there was among disciples. I'm less convinced by Mark Saint Germain's portrayal of Peter as a kind of institution man and Mary Magdalene as a kind of individualist. Uh, Sometimes, as I've read that portion of the play, I think of the confrontation between Catholics and Protestants during the 16th century. And I can see the value of that, but I'm not sure it really applies to those two. But anyway, having said that, yes, I mean, they are both all right, there are more than 12, clearly, in Capernaum. I have estimated that there were approximately 35 very close followers who lived in association with Jesus, both men and women. And yes, I think all of them knew each other personally and in many ways intimately.
Okay. Let's take another question from the room and we'll go back to Zoom.
Yes.
I'm just curious to go back to Mary Magdalene's early days and why she had so many anointments or exorcisms, as you called them. I mean, what was all that about? What was it in her life that necessitated so many interventions?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I wish we could specify. I think that, as I mentioned, the fact that Tiberias, the city, began to exercise its influence was one reason for Mary Magdalene to suffer this kind of confusion, which in the ancient world was called possession. But as you suggest, the fact that the text in Luke refers to 7 demons, that would suggest that somehow in the time it was known what these behaviors were. And that's something I'm afraid we just can't know in historical terms. For this reason, There have from time to time been attempts to fill in a biography of Mary Magdalene. I'm not sure how successful they are. You know, because of what I do for a living, I come to have considerable amounts of engagement with people who are around the age of Mary Magdalene when she encountered Jesus. And I do notice that as time becomes more confused, people become more confused too. That people turn not only against one another, but also against themselves. So the events surrounding the foundation of Tiberius, for anyone sensitive living in Magdala, could well have included what was referred to at the time as being possession, and that we today would refer to as disorders of different kinds.
Heather, do you have a question?
Yes, Chris would like to know, did the Sanhedrin Council share control of Jerusalem with the Romans? What was that working relationship like during Jesus's life?
That is a great question and is exactly pertinent to this discussion. The Romans developed a unique policy towards Jerusalem and for that reason also towards Judaism. And the reason for that was that the Romans actually came into the picture in Jerusalem before Rome was an empire. While Rome was still a republic, they made a military alliance with the Maccabean regime in Jerusalem. This is in the 2nd century before the Common Era. And that alliance involved their recognition of one another. And in the ancient world, when you recognized another party in the international field, you also recognized that person's religion. You acknowledged that it was going to take place. As a result of that, at that time and much later, Judaism was recognized by Rome as being what they called a legal religion. That is, something that their subjects could practice. When Rome became an empire, however, strain on that policy began to emerge because within the Roman Empire, the emperor was seen as himself a divine figure. So much so that actual worship of the emperor and his image came to be practiced in the empire. Naturally, this was a totally impossible idea from the point of view of Judaism. That would involve worshiping a false god and idolatry. But as a result of that, Rome developed a uniquely protective relationship with the temple in Jerusalem. The arrangement was in the temple, twice a day, every day, sacrifice would be offered on the emperor's behalf. That is, the high priest, Caiaphas in this case, the high priest was not worshiping the emperor. He was in effect praying for the emperor. And that arrangement was good enough for the Romans under the empire to establish a way of living with Judaism and with the power structure in the temple. We can see how important this is because after the death of Jesus, in the year 66, when the manager in charge of the temple decided there would be no more sacrifices accepted from any Gentile, including the emperor, then the Roman Senate sent their legions to destroy the temple and Jerusalem. So it's very interesting. What it shows us is that prior to that, prior to the war with Rome, that really broke out in 66, the temple functioned as a symbol both of the worship of Israel and of the dominance of Rome. It's a very delicate balance of power. And that, in the end, is why Jesus was crucified. He was interfering with that balance, which is why he was put to death by the Roman prefect, not by the high priest, who actually didn't have any power to execute by crucifixion.
Take another question here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peggy. You, how do you distinguish, or let me rather say, material culture and historical record alike sound like they privilege the third component of your analysis of the Magdalene, the vision component, over the mother of Constantine. But in the culture of the time, the emperor's mother would have an enormous amount of credence. And in the context of her time, Mary Magdalene had very little. So I get it that the stuff on the ground gives us credence, but how do we privilege one over the other today?
Mm-hmm. I think this is a very good overall interpretative question. And I would develop it along the following lines, that the material and the historical, I think we have seen over the course of the past 30 years, really do work together in order to give us a deeper analysis of the historical forces going on within any given environment. I mean, I am particularly interested in the material culture of the first century, but this same connection between the material and the historical applies elsewhere. Then we come to the issue of the visionary. Within the study of the New Testament, there has been, I think without question, a deliberate tendency to ignore the visionary component. So that one of the reasons for which I wrote my biography on Mary Magdalene was actually to underscore how important it was that she developed a visionary practice, which in turn influenced others. Now, among those others, I completely agree with you, was Helena, the mother of Constantine. However, what's very interesting is that Helena's visions, like visions of her time, because I think one could actually, at this stage, begin to write a history of vision. In the case of Helena, the visionary component does not begin with experience. Instead, it intervenes on experience. And this becomes a possibility for the simple reason that by the time of the 4th century, some Christians had acquired considerable power. It's notable, for example, that when, as a result of his mother's vision, Constantine ordered an excavation, he found some nails, which he identified with nails in the cross, and had one melted down to go into his helmet. So that the assertion of vision was very much, in my judgment, confused with the assertion of power. Whereas in the case of Mary Magdalene's visions in the New Testament, and indeed later than that in Gnostic literature, vision is a matter of something that begins with material and historical perception and then grows from that as a result of interpretation. But having said that, I do think that something that I am encouraging PhD students to undertake at the moment is that a truly comparative study of vision, that is not a study that simply tries one model, but a truly comparative study of vision would enable us to see this more clearly. But once that's written, my hunch at the moment is that what we would find is that the claim of power has an extraordinary influence on the way in which people assert vision.
Thank you.
I think we're gonna take one last question.
I just have a question about the rebellion in Jerusalem. And I was kind of under the impression there was a more widespread rebellion throughout Israel, which caused the Romans, they couldn't address it sooner because of a lot of confusion in actual Rome as to who's gonna be the leader. It took them a little while to get over there to crush it, and once they came back to Jerusalem to address it, they just crushed the whole country. And it was at the end of Mossad, and then it was Mossad taking over that little area.
Yeah, there are, I think, several levels of conflict going on at the time. The conflict, however, which was really the crucible of the revolt against Rome, was Jerusalem itself. And that was a factor because of the growth of what I've called priestly nationalism in Jerusalem, which came to assert, as I mentioned earlier, we actually don't want any Roman involvement in the temple. Now, prior to that time, what you say is true. There had been increasing violence, especially in Judea, but also in Samaria. And that violence, which involved Roman forces, was caused by a combination of the incompetence of the Roman army and also an increasing sense of nationalism on the part of many practitioners of Judaism. Having said that, however, the real hub of the revolt was Jerusalem itself. That's where the battle plans were literally made up by the Jewish rebels. I mentioned earlier Josephus. He came onto the scene, historically speaking, because he was assigned as a general to defend Galilee. He was a disaster. And as a result of what he did, he actually betrayed his cause to the Romans and became a Roman propagandist. And later describes in his work, The Jewish War, how he went around the walls of Jerusalem telling people they should give up. Then, believe it or not, he was surprised when someone threw a rock at him. So there's that side of Josephus. But then, as you rightly say, there's also the very complex Roman side, because the Romans were going into this battle at a time when, although their army was more invincible than the rebels knew, the imperial structure was just dreadful. They did not have good imperial leadership. During the course of the Jewish War, they actually went through successive emperors, a whole series of assassinations, until the winner was, lo and behold, Vespasian, who had been the Roman general sent to Judea. As a result of that war, he becomes famous, becomes the emperor. His son, Titus, finishes up the war, makes Judea, from a Roman point of view, pacified once again. And this Titus begins a very famous liaison with Berenice, who was the great-granddaughter of Herod the Great. And she goes to Rome. Well, I won't tell you what happens then, because my biography of Berenice will be out next year.
Let me ask you about some questions. So how many of you have seen Magdalene already? Anybody? At least one person. Oh, so most of you haven't seen it yet. So it's really interesting to see how this conversation influences the way you receive it. So after you see it, please come and tell me what you thought based on the information that Dr. Chilton has shared with you. So if you're interested in more, as Bruce has said, his did we lose him?
No, I just want to share the cover of the book.
Oh, great. This is his book, Mary Magdalene, a biography. I encourage you, if you're interested in more information, to check that out and read. I think that even we've asked Four Seasons to order it. If they don't have it in there, they have it in there. Great. So check out Four Seasons Bookstore and enjoy that. And please join me in thanking Dr. Bruce.
Thanks very much.
Bruce, what time is it there?
Let me see now. It's now 5:15.
All right. So thank you very much for making time for us while you were in Paris, and we hope to meet you in person someday soon.
I hope that works out. I would really enjoy that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all.